Son of a gun. Okay, so so we're back at it, and I just wanted to say sorry about that. That we are in business. Sorry. Um, okay, good. Okay, so I'm back. So I just wanted to say that thank you for tuning in, and sorry for that. What I'll try to do is, well, I don't think I can fix it, but what I'll do is I'll put a timestamp in there so you can get to the beginning of this. But I wanted to do this this one video tonight because I've had some really great comments that have come in from a guy named Josiah, and he's actually throwing some challenges at me regarding the Olivet Discourse. So the Olivet Discourse is just one of those discourses. It's one of those sections of prophecy that I guess you would say it's really one of those controversial passages. And so he says, so this was a community post that I posted the other day. It was about inerrancy, and I had made the claim that I believe in. Let's put it this way: I believe in general inerrancy. I believe that the scriptures inherently do what they were designed to do if they're correctly used. But as far as like verbal inerrancy, like absolute verbal, like every dot, every jot, every tittle has some like mystical meaning. I don't believe that. I believe that the writers were inspired, not necessarily the writings themselves. And of course, the communications. This is kind of where it gets tricky because, yeah, okay, well, you could say that the writings are inspired, but what do you mean when you say that the writings are inspired? You don't mean that a piece of paper was inspired, right? You mean that somebody wrote inspired truth and they preserved it for us. And saying that the writers are inspired and then they wrote down what they had received from the Lord, I think is the smartest way to approach the doctrine of inspiration. So the apostles, they especially when we come to like say the synoptics. Well, I mean Luke, Luke wasn't one of the apostles, but we have Matthew, we have Mark, we have Luke, we have John, and they all write different accounts. Well, you have to collate these accounts. You have to study these accounts and compare them to know, to see, to find out what's going on and to find out what the doctrine is. And so you can't just start off with one, with a presupposition that says, well, they're all by the same writer. Well, they're really not by the same writer. They're by different writers, and they're all receiving divine truth. But they may not line up in every single aspect. And what you have to do is you have to go back and you really have to study everything that they say to get the full picture of what it is that God is telling us. And so Josiah, he weighed in and he said, forget Paul. Forget Paul and the other apostles for inerrancy. If you claim that Jesus' words aren't inerrant, then Jesus would in fact be a false prophet. Sure, you can try to make the claim that Luke maybe had a little too much wine to drink when he was recounting the Olivet Discourse and messed up on the timing. That's why we don't just take Luke's word for it alone. We read the synoptic gospels in light of each other. And what do you know? They all seem to agree on the timing text. And that's absolutely true. They do seem to agree on the timing text. Now, I will say this. I will say that Christ does hedge his bets quite often. And so if you read Bullinger, and I would recommend that everybody read Bullinger, especially even if you have his companion Bible and you look at texts like, say, Matthew 10:23, Matthew 16:28, of course, the famous one, Matthew 24:34, you'll see there all the way the Greek grammar is constructed is they all contain conditional clauses. And so when you read Young, for example, Young's literal, you'll see him say, this generation shall not pass, or he says this generation may not pass until all these may come to pass. I think that's his translation, is because the word gnomai, that's not the word used for fulfillment. The word for fulfillment is plero. Gnomai actually means to begin to be or come to pass. And so you could even say, this generation shall not pass away till all these things begin to be, or till they all come to pass. And so it's a condition. And so what happens is the nation is given a 40-year period to repent. And when they don't repent, that's it. Their city's wiped out. They're cut off from the olive tree. And then the Gentiles are grafted in. And then that's when the church age begins. And so that's what I believe. So yeah, there's lots of timing texts. He was at the door. He was knocking at the door. He was, the judge he was standing when when Stephen was testifying before the Sanhedrin. He looked up and he saw Christ standing. So he was ready to return. He could have returned in AD 30. He could have returned in AD 40. He could have returned in AD 50. Instead, he at the end of that 40 years, because that's when their time ran out to repent. So during that time, he was at the doors. During that time, he was coming quickly. He was about to come quickly. And all that tells us, all the time texts do, all they tell us is that when those particular texts were written, the Christ was at hand, or he was imminent. Or to make a more minimalistic claim, the writers who wrote it believed that he was imminent during the time, the actual moment when they were writing. So what we find, and we've discussed this, Jeremy and I and SoCal Press, we discussed the earlier epistles of Paul versus the later epistles. We find that there is a change of imminency in the later epistles, and this is a game changer because even Bart Ehrman, in his book entitled Forged, he lays out this brilliant case, and I don't agree with his conclusions, but he lays out this brilliant case for stating that the pastoral epistles couldn't have been written by Paul because it's completely different. Paul's no longer looking at the end of the world being right around the corner, or I should say the ends of the age. He's no longer telling people not to get married. He's saying, well, now get married. I want the younger women to get married, to have a family, to guide children. The Corinthian church didn't have church officers. Paul wasn't writing to the church officers saying, hey, you've got all these divisions in your church, get your parishioners in order. There were no church officers. And Ehrman actually points this out. The reason why there weren't church officers is because the end was right around the corner. And you don't need church officers if the end can be tomorrow. But once it became obvious that the Jews weren't going to accept the kingdom program, and we find that in Acts 28, now you have to have a different program. And so Paul starts setting up for this different program. And so there's a de-emphasis of imminency in those later epistles. So this was very, very brilliantly brought out by Bullinger in his book, Foundations of Dispensational Truth. And it's something that's had a tremendous impact on me. So time texts aside, time texts are important, but we don't want to, if we assume that they connote predictive infallibility, I think we're making a mistake. Timing is one of those issues. It's always been a wild card. It was a wild card in the Old Testament. It's a wild card in the New Testament. Times and seasons are in the Father's under the Father's control. I don't think he's given us the times and seasons. Now, he could tell us that this is going to happen soon if it's imminent. But does it mean that it's absolutely positively going to happen? I don't think so. And that's something that we can debate and discuss as we move forward in these discussions. But again, it's a matter of further study, I think. So he said that, he's talking about Jesus, John not dying and all that. And so I responded to him. I said, have you read John Gill? I believe there's a coming of Christ in AD 70. So this is the beautiful thing. Because when you read the texts that speak of Israel's kingdom program, what was supposed to happen at what you would call the first advent, but there was really no two advents in the Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament scriptures, now the doctrine of a double coming is contained. It's wrapped up in typology. So it's in the story of Moses and in the story of Joseph. You find Moses coming to his brethren. He's rejected by his brethren. He goes to the Gentiles. He gets himself a Gentile wife, and then he comes back again 40 years later. And then his brethren accept him the second time. Same thing with the story of Joseph. But as far as what you would say, explicit prediction, I don't believe the Old Testament explicitly predicts two comings. So now you've got a problem, because you've got the New Testament, which says there's two comings, or which teaches that there's two comings. And then this is in contrast to the Old Testament, which seems to speak of, the advent of Messiah, where things were supposed to take place. The Jews were supposed, well, first of all, the Jews were supposed to be regathered. The nations were to be judged, right? The ethne were to be judged. There was to be a reestablishment, a rebuilding of Jerusalem. And then there's more little known prophecies which speak of the Jews, the saved remnant that are left, participating in the last battle against the Goyim. And so we have this brought out in Micah. We have this brought out in, I believe, Malachi, and in a couple of other places. We have the Jews that are saved. They're participating in this battle against the Goyim. And so, they're of course, they're victorious. They're successful. And so they put down their oppressors. This is going back to the book of Esther with the institution of Purim, how there was an edict against the Jews to destroy them. And then, they ended up, destroying their persecutors. So a lot of types play into this eschatological, thing that we have going on in the New Testament, also in the Old. And so you don't really want to try to have a, really monolithic view that's not going to, lock everything down and say, well, there's only one way that I could possibly approach this text. There's a lot of ways you can approach a text. And so, this is why I like to study different views. But I wrote him back and I said, so I believe there's a coming of Christ in AD 70, meaning that the kingdom came in AD 70, but not as it had been anticipated. In other words, it didn't come according to Israel's kingdom program. It came according to the evangelical, this evangelical spiritual gospel church state that we read of being revealed almost immediately once the Jews start to reject Christ. Now we're starting to see that there's a spiritual kingdom that's coming more and more into focus throughout the Gospels. And this is the kingdom that actually is established in AD 70. So yes, it was a coming of Christ in the same manner that, that Jehovah came into the garden at the end of the day to pronounce that judgment upon Adam and Eve after they had sinned, and then they were evicted from the garden. So it was a coming, but it wasn't the second coming. It wasn't the parousia. So how does this play out in a theological system? How does it deal with issues of consistency and tying the scriptures together? Well, actually quite well. And this is what I've been doing for the past 17 years. And so I wrote him back and I said, the second coming is part and parcel of Israel's kingdom program, is conditional on Jewish national repentance. They have 40 years to repent. In AD 70, Christ came spiritually to lead the new generation into the land. Luke 21 is a different account and deals more with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Present church age falls between Daniel 9 verses 26 and 27. I don't take Luke's word. I study and analyze all the writings, etc., etc. So if you watch my debate with Tommy McMurtry, it was on Donnie Badinsky's channel, but I do have it in my feed. It was an excellent debate. It was a great debate on both sides. Tommy did a great job. I think I did a better job, obviously, in bringing out the structure of the Olivet Discourse. But if you want to know what I think about the Olivet Discourse, just watch my opening statement. I'll lay out a very clear case for a difference between Luke 21 and Matthew chapter 24 / Mark 13. And I got this from Bullinger. I learned about this alternative approach as early as, I think it was 2008, is when I got his book, 10 Sermons on the Second Advent, in which he details the differences between Luke 21. So this is going back, this is a view that's been around for over 100 years. And probably closer to like 140 years. And it's coherent, it's sane, and it allows us to build a better structure for understanding prophecies from the Old Testament and, of course, the New Testament. So we went on, and then he threw some stuff back at me, which I appreciated, and then I, of course, threw some stuff back at him. So you could go to the blog, to the community page of my on my channel, and you can actually read these comments for yourself. I'm not gonna get into the whole thing, because what I want to do is I want to get into some actual exegesis, or actually what I conceive to be exegesis, and so I'm going to do that right now. Let me go ahead and let's see. I'm going to remove this, or actually I'm going to stop presenting. Okay, and then I'm going to represent. So here we go. Share. Okay, so let me just make sure. So I was in Daniel chapter 9 earlier, only because I was having a great discussion with Jeremy from New Heaven and New Earth Unveiled, and he actually has a view of the 70 weeks, which I haven't fully looked into yet. I'm going to probably do that sometime soon. It's based on a lot of some of what Sam Frost wrote. I haven't read Sam Frost's book either, so I'm thinking about it. But again, I've been because there's so many different views of the 70 weeks, and because there's so much hype about the 70 weeks, and there's so much been written, not just from futurist standpoints, but from preterist perspectives as well. What I'm doing is I'm really just going to the view that seems to answer the questions in the most direct way possible. And so the one that makes the most sense to me is the one that starts the 70 weeks with the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus. That would have been the decree in Nehemiah chapter 2. Because that's the one where he actually gets permission to rebuild the walls, and that was what the actual the prophecy was about. It was to start from the commandment to rebuild the city. So it didn't really have anything to do with the temple. But what I want to do is I want to draw your attention. I'm going to get away from the Hebrew here, and I want to go to the King James. Let's see, King James. Because what I want to do is I want to get into Luke. Let's see. I'm looking for KJV. See if I can go back. Here we go, KJV. And then so Luke 21 is important because, and it actually starts his discourse the section, there's a timestamp in Luke 20. And it places the giving of the Olivet Discourse in a different setting. And this is why Bullinger and myself as well, why we give priority to Luke chapter 20. So he says, Luke says in verse 1, he says, "And it came to pass that on one of those days, as he taught the people in the temple and preached the gospel." So he's sitting in the temple and he's teaching the people. Now, when you get to chapter 21, now there's no further timestamp in this chapter. And then when you get to 21, he's still in the temple, mind you, but he looks up and he sees the rich men casting their gifts into the treasury. And this gives him occasion to speak of the destruction of the temple, because they say, well, how it's adorned with goodly stones and gifts, etc. And he says, "For these things which ye behold, the days will come, in the which there shall not be left one stone upon another, they shall not be thrown down." And that's what launches him into this discourse. Now, the next timestamp is actually at the end of the chapter. In verse 37, it says, "In the daytime he was teaching in the temple, and at night he went out and abode in the mount that is called the Mount of Olives." So he doesn't actually go out to the Mount of Olives until at that night. So he was teaching in the temple all day, and it was during that time when he was teaching that he gives this prediction. So it's a different setting. Now, we could accept that. We could argue with that. We could say, well, we could make allowances for the apostles. Well, maybe, we could make allowances. We could say that was possibly a copying error. We could say that Luke had a different design when he was writing this. We could say that, that he was using documents. There's all kinds of theories. I'm not interested in a single one of them. What I want to do, though, is I wanted to draw your attention to that, because I'm giving priority to Luke. So I'm starting with Luke because that's where because his text, his sermon was given in the temple, and this is prior to his going out to the Mount of Olives. So might not agree with that, but that's what I'm going to do. So he starts off with with what you might call a parallel passage to say Matthew 24 and Luke 13. He says, his disciples ask him, Master, when shall these things be? What sign will there be once these things come to pass? And he said, Take heed that you be not deceived, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and the time draweth near. Go ye not therefore after them, but when ye shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified, for these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. And so he's kind of going to be doing the Olivet Discourse thing, very similar to Matthew chapter 24. And he says, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and great earthquakes shall be in diverse places, and famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. And then in verse 12, he says, but before all these, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for a name's sake. And so he digresses. He talks about what's going to happen, whereas Matthew goes on to say these are the beginning of sorrows. Instead of talking about the beginning of sorrows, Luke digresses, and he goes and he describes what's going to take place before the beginning of sorrows. And so this description here that he's giving, it takes it all the way up to the destruction of Jerusalem. And he's talking about, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, and know that the desolation thereof is nigh, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, etc., etc. For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. Very similar to what Matthew and Mark write about concerning the Great Tribulation, but it's not the same thing. And of course, he talks about Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. Now, this passage here, verse 24, this takes us all the way up to, I believe this takes us all the way up to the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was in 135 AD. So this is a sustained, I guess you could call it warfare. But what it is it's really talking about great distress in the land and wrath upon this people. It's talking about their ultimate subjugation by the Roman authorities and their ultimate eviction from the land, which started, there was an eviction in AD 70, and so that's where we have to date the eviction from, but it wasn't completely realized until some years later. So is that a problem? No, that's not a problem. It's not going to impact my interpretation at all. Probably shouldn't impact yours either. But he's talking about this, what's going to happen in the Roman Jewish wars. And then he picks up the thread again, and he's talking about signs in the sun and in the moon and the stars. And so this is where Matthew 24 and Mark 13 become parallel again. And that's when, of course, he talks about his coming in the clouds, which should have taken place, I believe, in the first century, but it didn't. Now, this phrase right here, actually, the phrase abomination and desolation, we'll get to that in just a moment. But he says, when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. So this actually happened in AD 66. We know this. We know that Cestius Gallus came out. He broke through some of the outer fortifications, but he never actually got to the inner city. Now, Josephus says that because the city was being taken over by robbers and criminals and whatnot, that the people that were in the city of Jerusalem, if Cestius Gallus had continued, making his advance toward the city, if he had reached the outer gates of the city, the people would have opened to him, because they wanted to be delivered from these robbers and these bandits that were marauding the city and that were killing people, raping people, etc. But what he did was, without no reason at all, or with no reason, he departed from the city. He completely retreated, and nobody knows why. Historians have looked at this and they've speculated, well, why did he retreat from the city? Nobody knows why, but his retreat from the city, it was in the fall of AD 66, actually allowed the Jewish Christian population to flee to Pella. That's where we have that flight to Pella, which you often hear preterists mention. Oh yeah, the flight to Pella, that was supposed to be, and that may very well have been, a type or an illustrative fulfillment of First Thessalonians. I don't think it was, but people could press that point. And so that's what happens. Now, when you're talking about the abomination of desolation, that's something quite different. That's talking about actually getting into the city, getting into the temple, and actually doing what Antiochus did in 164 BC. It was around that time. And that's, of course, that's recorded in Maccabees, in the first Maccabees, second Maccabees. That's recorded. So what is it, so Josiah and others, I've heard others say this too, they'll argue that the surrounding of Jerusalem with armies is the same exact thing as the abomination of desolation, but it's not. And I'm going to show you why it's not, because when we go to Matthew chapter 24, go to Matthew chapter 24, you're going to see that in verse 15, he says, when you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand. And he says again, those who are in Judea flee into the mountains, etc. So I want to see right now, let me see. So it says, then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains. So it doesn't necessarily say anything to the people that were in Jerusalem, like, well, the Jerusalemites, that's when they had a chance to escape. But everybody recognizes that this right here took place in AD 66. Now, this is where it gets kind of complicated, because it seems like Matthew, and it seems like, Matthew and Mark, it seems like Luke, it seems like they're kind of mingling their accounts with each other. And so from a purely critical standpoint, this is where we have to if you accept the P or the Mark Q, the Q Mark theory, that there was a document named Q that Matthew and I guess Luke borrowed from, and then one of them borrowed from Mark, but it's a kind of a convoluted view. But I don't necessarily agree with that view. But what I do believe, what I think they were doing, was they may have made use of documents. They may have also made use of some oral tradition, and they also may have, because remember, Luke wasn't there. Luke doesn't know exactly. Luke wasn't there when Christ spoke those words. So what he's doing, his purpose in talking about the surrounding of the cities, was he possibly confusing the abomination of desolation with the surrounding? I don't know. That's a mystery of critical scholarship that I don't think anyone has solved yet. What I do want to say, though, is I think there's enough evidence for us to conclude that these were written prior to AD 70. So I don't accept the view that, these all Vaticana ex eventu prophecies are written after the fact. That, like, they wrote them after the fact. They did a horrible job in lining up all the details and making everything fit. The only way you can account for the discrepancies in these narratives, in these different synoptic accounts, is to assume that they were writing independently, and that what they wrote was before any predictions concerning AD 70 actually took place. Again, that's something that I don't really have time to get into tonight, but I can do something on that in a future podcast or discussion. But he's talking about the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. So he's pointing us back to Daniel. Now, I do believe that Christ is speaking these words, and so this interpolation, whoso readeth, let him understand, they may be Christ's words, or they may be Matthew's words. I don't know. It's one of those, again, that's something that, it depends on which interpreter you read. You may find, the weight of the evidence on one side or on the other. But when we go back to Daniel, what I want to show you is, let's see. So when we go back to Daniel, we're going to find that the 70 weeks were determined upon the people and upon the holy city. Then he gives 6 target objectives. So it's to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and the prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the commandment to restore and to build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall even in troublous times. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the ends of the war desolations are determined. So this right here, this verse, this clause right here in verse 26, this is what happened in AD 70. So this, I think, is what Luke is dealing with. Luke is dealing with that parenthetical passage that I pointed out, that I think occurs in verses from verse 12 to, I think, verse 24. There's a parenthetical passage where, instead of describing everything that occurs upon the commencement of the beginning of sorrows, he goes back, he digresses, he goes back, he says what's going to happen before that, and then he takes his narrative all the way up to the destruction of Jerusalem, and beyond the destruction of Jerusalem to the ultimate eviction of the Jews from the land of Palestine. And then he of course goes back and he describes what's going to happen at the end of the end of the Adamic age, which is what Matthew's discourse was intended to address anyway. That's the thing that we need to get right. Matthew's discourse was intended to, or actually, I should say, Matthew's account of the Olivet discourse was intended to address the end of the Adamic age, and the ending of the Adamic age was a possibility during that 40 years. And so you're going to find similarities between the different, between what was happening at the ends of the Mosaic age, because that should have been the ends of the Adamic age. Had the Jews repented, had they accepted Jesus Christ as their Messiah, then those prophecies would have come to pass. But because they didn't come to pass, it was the ends of the Mosaic age, and then the Adamic age is future. Now, Luke and Mark and Matthew, they're going to deal with this different ways. And so one thing to keep in mind while you're researching these passages for yourself is to pinpoint, to bookmark this passage right here. And the people of the Prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the ends thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the ends of the war desolations are determined. Full stop. That describes everything that Luke had described about the desolation of Jerusalem. But then we have that can take it up to AD 70. But we have verse 27. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and oblation to cease, and for the overspreading of abominations shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured upon the desolate. So that's talking about the abomination of desolation. That is actually future. Now, what's going on from AD 70 to, say, the present time right now is we're in the church age. So the church age actually is between verses 26 and 27. So when he's talking about the abomination of desolation, this is a very technical prophecy. So I'm not going to go back to the Hebrew and start going back, doing the interlinear thing and saying, well, this word means this and that word means that. That's going to take too long. But what students of prophecy understand, it doesn't matter whether you're Hal Lindsey or whether you're Randall Price or whether you're Brock Hollett or whether you're Sam Frost. All prophecy students understands that when he's using this phrase, abomination of desolation, it's a technical expression, and it's talking about something that's going to happen in the middle of this last week. Now, I can't go through, every single passage that deals with the abomination of desolation. And there's different prophetic views as to what was meant, whether it's it was fulfilled completely by Antiochus, or whether Antiochus was mentioned in Daniel chapter 8, and then there's two little horns. You got that view. There's a lot of different views. The point to keep in mind is this, and I'm going to go to Daniel chapter 12. The point to keep in mind is this: is the daily sacrifice being taken away and the abomination that maketh desolate being set up take place at the same time. That is like a sine non qua non of interpreting these prophecies. And so in Daniel chapter 12, verse 11, it says, "And from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up," so from the time that this happens and this happens, there's going to be 1,290 days. And then he says, "Blessed is he that waiteth, and cometh to the 1,335 days. But go thy way till the end be, for thou shalt rest, and stand in thy lot at the end of the days." So he's not talking. So I know Josiah, he had said something to the effect of, well, there's the 1,290 days is actually between the daily sacrifice being taken away and the abomination that makes desolate set up. I think that's what he was telling me this morning, but I didn't really understand what he was saying. And I actually did say, hey, look, I'm going to make a video tonight. And if you still disagree, we could do a podcast at a future point. Doesn't have to be next week, could be next month, could be next year. And then you could challenge me with your views, or anybody could challenge me, because I don't mind being challenged. But what we have to understand is that these two occur synchronically. And so if you were to go to the Hebrew, and to go to verse 11, so he's saying from the time that is taken away, hatamid, this word right here, hatamid. And that's the tamid, is the daily sacrifice. And so that's a very technical word, isn't it? That's a very technical word. And then it says, and is set up. So this vav right here, it can function as a vowel, because a vav is one of the matras lectionis, or mothers of reading. And so there's a few consonants that actually serve as vowels. So he's going to say va, latat, or latate, va latate. So va is means and so he's saying, when is taken away the daily sacrifice, or the tamid, and is set up the abomination of desolation. So it's talking about two things happening at once. From the time these two things happen, there will be 1,290 days. So he's saying that they're going to happen together, and then there's going to be 1,290 days. Now, look, I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I've been studying Hebrew for like a little more than a year, like on and off, but I'm getting better. My vocabulary is getting better. And so I know what this says, even though I have helps. I've got interlinears, I've got concordances, I've got lexicons. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but I know that this is what it's teaching. It's teaching that from the time that this happens and this happens, there's going to be 1,290 days. And what that means, he's not saying that from the time that this happens, there's going to be 1,290 days. And from the time that this happens, there's going to be another number. He said, by the time these things happen, it's going to be 1,290 days. So that means they have to happen synchronically. Now, this is a problem. And I pointed this out to Josiah this morning. I said, this is a huge problem for preterism, because the preterists have to say that the surrounding of Jerusalem by armies, if they're going to make Luke 21 parallel with Matthew 24, then they have to say the surrounding of Jerusalem by armies happened in AD 66. But Titus didn't actually stop the daily sacrifice until over 3 years later. Or actually, I think it was a little less. It might have been right around 3 years. So that's a colossal problem. That's not a fulfillment of Daniel chapter 9. And so this is one of the reasons why I'm not a preterist, because I understand and I have understood these things for some time, even back in the days when Larry Siegel and I were going back and forth via blogs and discussion boards. And he said, "Hey, look, man, you know, I'm going to let you write an article on my blog about why you're a premillennialist." And and I did. And I haven't read that article in quite a while, but I know that I mentioned this 42 months. I know that I mentioned these time periods. So that's the reason why. Now, what I want to do right now. So professing preterist is weighing in. He's saying that. Let me see. He's saying that no, if you do the math, it's talking about the destruction of the temple. So this thing, we can go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth till the cows come home. But I just showed you that these two things have to happen together. So, and there's parallel passages. You find parallel passages in other places in Daniel. I can't go there because I don't have the time. So that's going to be something they'll have to tackle another time. But there's debate as to whether, say, Daniel chapter 8 is talking purely about Antiochus, because there's a little horn mentioned, right, in Daniel chapter 7. Well, Schofield and some of the earlier dispensationalists, and probably some of the modern dispensationalists, will tell you, well, the little horn in Daniel chapter 7 is the future beast, but in Daniel chapter 8, he's coming out of the Greek Empire, right? So it's talking about Antiochus. So it gets really difficult. But what you want to keep in mind is that there's these two things happen together: the taking away of the Tamid and the setting up of the abomination of desolation. Now, one of the reasons, and let me go ahead and because what I want to do is I just want to share a pictorial. Let me see. I just had it up this morning. Here it is. Okay, so let me get back to. Okay, so let me stop the screen, and then what I'll do again is I will present Chrome tab window. Here we go. This is what I want. And so the one that the chart that I did that I designed is actually a chart which I believe breaks everything down. Now, people are going to laugh when they see this and say, "Oh, he's trying to be like Hal Lindsey or whatever," and that's fine. I'll take that. I'll take the money too, but I'll take that criticism. So this is actually what I got. I got some of this from Donnie Badinsky, because Donnie, he wrote a book called Antichrist Revealed. It's an excellent book. You can find it on Amazon. And his thesis was that there's a shadow 70th week between AD 66 to AD 73. And that during this week is Titus stopped the daily sacrifices right in the middle of the week. So I was starting to think about that. And I've actually turned it over quite a while before I adopted it. And then I said, son of a... AD 66 is when Cestius Gallus retreated from Jerusalem. And then approximately 3 years later, we could say, remember, the Jews, they rounded off their numbers. So, 3 years can mean 3.5 years. It's, 40 years can mean, 36 years. Their numbers are are more fluid than most people would think. We're not looking for strict numerical accuracy, but we're looking for rounded off numbers, and they could be accurate. But I don't know exactly when this happened. It said it happened in September AD 66 was when Cestius Gallus retreated from Jerusalem. So looking a little over 3 years, right? 66, 67, 68, 69, 70. Then Titus stops the daily sacrifices. And so we have going on in the first, let me see if I can blow this up a little. So we have going on in the first, the first half of the week was that's when the book of Revelation was written. So we says 5 are fallen and 1 is. That was from June 68 to January 69, right after Nero died. So Nero died, and there was this rumor that he was going to return. and he was going to raise holy hell. He was going to return from Parthia with armed horsemen. He was going to make his own persecution, the Neronic persecution, which he had just participated in. He was going to make that look like the Mickey Mouse Club. And so they thought that he was going to return. Well, John thought that he was going to return by being raised from the dead. And so Nero had already died. 5 are fallen: Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero. And then Galba was reigning. Now, this was the year of I believe this was the year of the 3 emperors. And so they had Galba, Otho, and I think Vitellius was the next one. But they were all bitter enemies of Nero. And so Nero was going to come back, and then he was going to defeat 3 of them. And then he was going to be the 8th of the 7. So that's my theory. Now, what happens in June AD 68 was Nero commits suicide, and then shortly thereafter the book of Revelation was written. So we have the first half of the 70th week. It's the shadow week, right? And then the second half of the 70th week is taken up by the seals, the trumpets, and the vials. And so that's Revelation chapters 4 through 19. Now, the reason why this is important is because Christ says, when you see the abomination of desolation stand in the holy place, then know there will be great tribulation. And so the book of Revelation is describing that 3.5 period of great tribulation. Now, that never happened in the first century. Why? Because there was no abomination of desolation. It could have happened, and I believe that is if the 144,000 first fruits offering was presented to the high priest, I think that would have happened. I think Nero would have been raised from the dead. I think there would have been a great tribulation. How it was all going to come, play out on ground level, I don't think anybody can say. I mean, what would have happened had the Jews accepted Christ's mission the first time? Well, it's ostensible that the Roman armies would have persecuted the Jews, and they would have killed Christ, and then Christ would have risen from the dead. He would have come back. He would have destroyed the Goyim. You could chart these things out from the Old Testament prophets simply by reading the Old Testament prophets, and you could figure this kind of stuff out. But it's not going to be satisfying. It's not going to be constructive unless you put it within the proper framework of first century timing and fulfillment. So Nero commits suicide. The book of Revelation is written. The first half of the week runs out. And then what we have down here is we have the first century. So first, the shadow week, whatever this shadow week was, it was a screw up. It failed. The beginning of sorrows, it didn't bring forth birth. It was a stillborn birth. It was a failed harvest. And so what's going on now is there's going to be a future revival of first century church conditions. This is where we're getting into Matthew's prophecy, where we're starting to get into the nuts and bolts of Matthew's and Mark's description of the Olivet Discourse. Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. And then when you do have the man of sin being revealed, that's when you have the seals, trumpets, and the vials. Now look what you have over here. Let's see. What you have over here now is you have that 1,260 days. And then right here, you've got 30 days plus 45 days. Now, this is what I believe is going to happen after the tribulation. There's going to be a period of 30 days plus 45 days when certain things are going to take place. And so those certain things, let me blow this up even more. So the certain things are going to be the battle of Armageddon and the judgment of the Gentile nations. Let's see how I blow that up even more. So you can see this is really good quality. I did it in Adobe, so I kind of made it higher resolution just so that I could share it with people. So the battle of Armageddon, judgment of the Gentile nations, and that's going to take ostensibly this time period right here, or it could be for the building of a temple. there's disagreement among that. It's going to be the one spoken of in Ezekiel, or he's given us something better. Irenaeus does say there's going to be a temple in the land after Jesus Christ returns. He didn't say anything about it specifically being Ezekiel's temple, although Justin Martyr does kind of wink in that direction, although I'm sure if you would raise him from the dead and ask him if there are going to be animal sacrifices and all that, he'd probably throw a glass at your head. But I'm thinking that it's probably going to have to do with the judgment of the heathen and then the allotment of the saints' inheritance. So we remember when the angel told Daniel, you'll stand in thy lot at the end of the days, because they have to be allotted their inheritance in the millennial period. And so it's not like everything's going to happen like that. Christ actually is sitting on a throne during this period, and he's judging the nations. Nations are literally coming to him. He's judging them. The saints are receiving their allotment, not being judged, because remember, they're judged before the heathen are judged, because they're participating in the judgment against the heathen. So when he's talking about standing in your lot at the end of the days, what he's talking about is receiving your allotment in the land or wherever it is your allotment is going to be. So that's going to take that amount of time, most likely. And that's about it for the prophecy. So that's how I've got this all broken down. And the only thing I wanted to say is I mentioned the shadow week right here. But you don't even have to believe that. You don't have to believe any of that. You don't have to believe. You could believe this all happened in AD 70. So the problem with that view, though, the question that you'll have to answer, the $64,000 question, is going to be, what do you do with the abomination of desolation happening at the same time that the daily sacrifices are taken away? Do you say, well, that's when he came in with the Roman eagles, and that's when we don't know that happened. And when Antiochus desecrated the temple, I don't believe he destroyed the temple. What he did was he desecrated and he set up another image. So there's definitely some robust dialogue even among premillennialists as to what these prophecies signify, whether it's going to be a rebuilt temple or not. Now, I tend to take a more reformed view, where I think that what he's talking about is what Antiochus did to the old covenant people, the beast is going to do to the new covenant people. And he's not going to be like putting things in a Jewish temple, although I can say that may happen. I don't know. I'm saying it could also take place a different way, where what he's doing is he's got a one world religion, and he's trying to make Christians worship a fallible human being and worship that fallible human being's image. Because Paul said, he who defileth the temple of God, him will God destroy. So this could be that kind of fulfillment. We don't know. But what we do know is that there wasn't anything of that nature that took place in the first century. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop that screen. And then I'm just going to present one more time. Okay. So, there's different views. Now, I was talking to Jeremy earlier today, and we were going back and forth about Daniel's 70 weeks. And, and I understand the views that he holds, is that everything took place with the Antiochus. That doesn't affect my view at all, because even if it was all exhaustive by Antiochus, what John is doing in the book of Revelation is he's taking those prophecies, whatever was going on in Daniel, and if he's recontextualizing them, or he's showing what the true interpretation, the true fulfillment is. So it's an either or, okay? Recontextualization doesn't necessarily mean that the prophecy that he's contextualizing from had an exhaustive fulfillment, but it would lead you to believe that, right? So he's talking about Antiochus, everything that happened in Antiochus. What makes me not accept that interpretation is because, let me see if I can go to KJV. What makes me not accept that interpretation is because the prophecies, if you read the prophecies of Daniel, you'll see they really weren't fulfilled. I mean, they were kind of fulfilled, but they weren't, kind of doesn't get it with God. I mean, if the prophecy still is ambiguous enough, if the fulfillment is still ambiguous enough for people to keep looking for it, centuries afterwards, then I'm sorry, but that's not a fulfillment. Fulfillment is like, that it happened, or you have an inspired apostle who can tell you, okay, this has been fulfilled, which we don't have, according to, preterists and some futurists, we haven't had since AD 70. So everything is fulfilled, but you don't have anybody to tell you it's fulfilled. You're just barking up a tree. So in Daniel chapter 9, it's talking about the 70 weeks, talking about from the time the commandment goes forth to restore and build Jerusalem. Now, my friend Jeremy, he and I, we disagree on this. He says that, this was something to do with God's decree. And I don't know if I completely understand his view. He's basing his argument basically on different words being used. And, a different word is used that another word should have been used in arguments like that. And those arguments, those can sometimes help decrease the probability of a view being correct. If this word is being used for this concept time after time after time, and it's a pretty consistent pattern that we're seeing of that word being used, and then he uses a different word, yeah, okay, I get it. You have a right to perhaps question whether he's teaching the exact same thing, but I don't consider this to be a game changer, because the word that's being used is the word davar, which actually means quite a few different things. So he's going to go, let's see, Hebrew. So that word davar, now and of course the plural is going to be davarim. So this word davar, this word, if you look this up in Strong's Concordance, I've got Strong's Exhaustive Concordance. Literally, it's got like so many different meanings, so many different shades of meaning. And so see if I can find it. So most Hebrew nouns are actually, or I should say good portion of Hebrew nouns are actually derived from verbs, or they're derived from other nouns. And so this word davar, let's see. So this word davar, it's derived from, obviously there's a cognate verb, but he's talking about, let me see if I can click on this. Therefore, know and understand that from the going forth of the command. So this word right here is davar, and so that bet, if it doesn't have that dot in the middle, it's pronounced like V. But they'll say it's davar because it is still a bet. That's the actual letter. I think that dot is called like a dagesh len. I think that's the technical term for it. But this word, if you look this up, so it's going to be, let's see, it's going to be davar. It's a noun. It's a masculine noun. I'm trying to see. Let's see. And so it gives you, this is pretty good, because it gives you like every single occurrence of the word, I believe. And it comes from davar, which is a verb. So yeah, so it's derived from a verb, and the verb simply means to speak. So and then God spoke to Noah, saying, God spake unto Noah. When you could trace this through, and this is one of the reasons why I love helps, because you could do so much with the help that if you were transported to the year, say, 1500, or even, to the year like 1950, you didn't have all these. You had to go to the library to get all of these. And so, this has quite a few occurrences, and most of the occurrences, I think Jeremy pointed out, were going to be in the book, or the prophetic occurrences are going to be in the book of Jeremiah. Now, I haven't actually verified that for myself, because we were just talking. There's probably a continuation. We were just talking recently, just this afternoon, so I'll have to look into this. But again, the going forth of the commandments to rebuild Jerusalem, that can be none other than, in my opinion, my very humble opinion, the edict of Artaxerxes Longimanus, which was in approximately, I want to say it was approximately 450 BC. And of course, there's wiggle room there as well. So going to Nehemiah chapter 2. He's talking about, he's talking about the decree of Artaxerxes, the king. And he's talking about, well, he was the king's cupbearer. And he, the Persians, they had a law that, you couldn't offend the king. They had a lot of laws, but he was sad. He was crying or whatever, but he was sad. He was showing his sadness. And that was like a big no-no in front of the king, because you don't want to make the king have a bad day. And so he was afraid, but the king asked him what the issue was. And he said, why should not my countenance be sad when the city, the place of my father's sepulchres, lieth waste, and the gates thereof are consumed with fire? Then the king said unto me, for what dost thou make request? So I prayed to the God of heaven, and I said unto the king, if it pleases the king, and if thy servants have found favor in thy sight, that thou wouldest send me unto Judah, unto the city of my father's sepulchres, that I may build it. The king said unto me, the queen also sitting by him, for how long shall thy journey be? So he set him a time. And so the bottom line, the thing I'm getting at is that letters, what happened is Artaxerxes gave him letters to the different provinces. And to rebuild the city, to rebuild the walls, to rebuild the city. And so this is the context of what Daniel's talking about. The decree going forward to build Jerusalem doesn't have anything to do with the temple. And so he came to Jerusalem, he arose in the night, he took a little night journey around, and he saw everything broken down. And then he's talking about the Gentiles that were left in the land. They tried to oppose the rebuilding of the wall. So the streets shall be rebuilt, the walls will be rebuilt, even in troublous times. And so this fits perfectly with the decree of Artaxerxes Longimanus, which took place, I believe, I just want to check. Let's see. So it's it's anywhere from 454 BC to 444 BC. And I'm looking at the Schofield Bible here, and he says, in either case, we are brought to the time of Christ. And he says, prophetic time is invariably so near as to give full warning, so indeterminate as to give no satisfaction to mere curiosity. And so that's the point. That's one of the points that Donnie Badinsky brought out in his book. He said, there can't be an exact calculation up to the time of Christ so that you can actually calculate the very year that Christ is going to come. That would frustrate the very nature of prophecy. And also, we would see some of those calculations. We would see people trying to figure out, prophetic fulfillment via mathematics. We might see some of that in the New Testament. People saying, hey, the 70 weeks are fulfilled. And there is a verse where John says, the time is fulfilled, but I don't think we can prove that time necessarily means any portion of the 70 weeks. I don't, maybe it may mean that, but I don't think it has to mean that. So until more data comes through, I think we should probably suspend judgment. But again, a lot of good stuff here, but I personally don't think that this is a game changer, that the word debar is used. Because to be honest, this decree of Nehemiah, it doesn't specifically say whether it's a decree or not. It says that it simply says that Artaxerxes gave Nehemiah letters. It doesn't say there was any decree. Now, I didn't, reread the whole book. There may be something in another chapter that says that. But just judging from this initial permission that's given to Nehemiah to go and rebuild the walls, it doesn't say that it's a decree. It doesn't say that it's a word. It doesn't say that it's, Jeremy's talking about two other words that are used, and I'm going to look those up as well. And it's a lot of challenging stuff. I appreciate him for doing that, but none of those words are used. So it kind of begs the questions like, well, if those words were used, it could be any one of them, right? It could be a decree. It could be a word. It could be any one of them, because the devar is used sometimes for a decree or commandment. Even in the Orthodox Jewish Bible, it says a decree. That's how they translated it. So it's an open it's an open question, and it's not something that we're going to solve tonight. But I do want to say that it takes us up to the time of Christ. And what we have is, most scholars will tell you that the Christ was crucified, okay, either in the middle of the 70th week or at the end of the 69th week and before the beginning of the 70th. Now, that's the view that I hold. And I hold that, there is a future 70th week. And there was a shadow week. There was a possibility of that 70th week being fulfilled in the first century, but it never came to pass. If it had come to pass, we would have seen the abomination of desolation. We would have seen, the Great Tribulation. We would have seen all that, and that would have taken place from AD 70 to AD 73, filling up the final 3.5 years of the Jewish-Roman War. It wouldn't have taken place from 67 to 70. That's still the first half of the shadow week. So, like I said, you don't have to believe that view, and probably a lot of people are not going to, but it's just something I wanted to throw out there because it did have, it was germane to my interpretation of Olivet. But like I said, go back, rewatch the debate with Tommy McMurtry, and hopefully you get something good out of it. But anyways, I'm going to leave. Hopefully next week I'll be back again. If you have any ideas for any podcasts, any programs, any other shows, any discussions that you want to do, just let me know. Let's see. Steve's weighing in, says 457 BC to 27 AD is exactly 483 years. So, there you go. So I think this makes sense. But again, people are going to disagree. People have always disagreed. It's a difficult prophecy. It's definitely not something for like someone who's just a beginner Christian who's just studying the Bible. And it's something that you got to really be in the pages a long time before you want to really tackle it. But anyways, be back next week. Until then, I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your week, and we'll talk to you soon.